My sister inherited our parents' luxurious restaurant, while I was given the dishwashing job there. Start from the bottom, they laughed. But when I became their competition, they regretted it. My name is Rodrigo Molina. I'm 26 years old. And this is the story of how my own family betrayed me, and then lived to regret it. For as long as I can remember, my family has owned Asador Molina, a well-known restaurant in Alicante. It's the kind of place where families celebrate birthdays, where businessmen take their clients, and where locals go when they want a good steak. And me? I love to cook. Not just I enjoy making dinner every now and then. No, I lived for it. I was never officially employed at the restaurant, but since my teens I spent every free moment in the kitchen. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. While my sister Valeria was out shopping or talking about her grand business ventures that never lasted more than a few months, I was in the back, learning alongside Hugo, our longtime head chef. Hugo wasn't just some guy flipping burgers, he was an artist. He trained in some of the best kitchens in the country before coming to work with my father, and he saw something in me that my own parents never did. "Kid, you've got real talent," he'd tell me, handing me a knife to practice my cuts. At 16, I could grill a steak to the perfect point just by touch. At 21, I knew every recipe, every supplier, and every trick that made the kitchen run like a well-oiled machine. Did my parents care? No. To them, I was just playing in the kitchen while Valeria was the serious one, the responsible one, the future of the business. And then one night they showed me how little they really thought of me. Flashback to the night that changed everything. It was a Sunday. We were all crammed around our small dining room table. Mom, Dad, Valeria, and me. "We've made a decision about the future of Asador Molina," my father announced, placing his fork on his plate. I straightened up. This was it. Finally, they would recognize all the work I'd put in. "We're going to hand the restaurant over to Valeria," my mother said with a proud smile. I stared at them. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. Wait, what? I looked at Valeria, expecting her to correct them, but she didn't. Instead, she smirked. "I mean, it makes sense. I have a degree in business administration." A degree she barely managed to get, by the way. Meanwhile, I've been working tirelessly in that kitchen for over a decade. "Mom, Dad." I started trying to keep my voice steady. "I've worked at Asador Molina since I was a kid. I know the menu better than anyone. I've trained with Hugo. Valeria hasn't even worked a single shift in the kitchen." "Rodrigo, don't be ridiculous," she said, waving her hand as if I were overreacting. Dad sighed. "You're a great cook, son, but running a restaurant isn't just about the food. Valeria understands the brand, the marketing, the big picture. She doesn't even know how to take an order, let alone run a kitchen," I thought. "That's why you'll still have a job," Mom said, as if she were doing me a favor. I frowned. "What job?" Valeria leaned forward with a slow, mocking smile. "Oh, this is the best part. You'll start as a dishwasher and work your way up." Silence. I stared at my parents, waiting for them to correct her. They didn't. They just nodded as if this were something reasonable, as if I should be grateful. "You'll learn discipline this way," Dad added. "Hard work builds character." "And Valeria?" She was laughing her head off. "Come on, Rodrigo," she said, pretending to wipe a tear. "You always said you loved being in the kitchen. Well, now you can spend all the time there." I clenched my jaw so tight it actually hurt. They thought I was nothing more than the help. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "Thank you," I said. "I'll make the most of it." And I would. Back to the present. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of Valeria running Asador Molina straight into the ground, messing up orders, firing the best staff, raising prices while shrinking portions, and driving away the regular customers who had kept us afloat for decades. 2 years of my parents pretending she was some kind of genius while I washed dishes in the back. What they didn't know was that I had a plan. And the day I walked out of that kitchen for good was the day I started building something that would make them regret every single one of their decisions. So, you want to know what happened next? Buckle up, because this is where the story starts to get really good. The reality of starting from the bottom after that dinner, I convinced myself to stay at Asador Molina, just to see how far it could fall under Valeria's management. Spoiler alert. It was a disaster. In the first week, she fired 2 of our best waiters because they didn't respect her authority. By the end of the month, she'd switched to a cheaper meat supplier, inflated the prices, and infuriated Hugo so much he almost quit. And me? I kept washing dishes, pretending I wasn't watching the ship sink in real time. One night, while I had my arms submerged in greasy water, Hugo stormed into the dishwashing area. His chef's jacket unbuttoned and his face red with anger. "Rodrigo, I can't take it anymore," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "She just told me we're switching from homemade fries to frozen." "Frozen?" I echoed. "What's next, microwaved steaks?" I sighed, wiping my hands on my apron. "Do you really think she's going to stop there?" Hugo held my gaze. Then, after a moment, he pulled a cigarette from his pocket and gestured for me to follow him outside. Behind the kitchen, he lit the cigarette and took a long drag. "I don't know how much longer I can stand it, kid. This place used to mean something. Your grandfather built it from the ground up. Your father at least kept it stable. But Valeria," he scoffed, "she's destroying it." I nodded. I'd seen it firsthand. The regulars weren't coming as often anymore. The online reviews were plummeting, and the kitchen staff hated her. "She doesn't care about the food," I said quietly. Hugo exhaled a cloud of smoke. "No. And your parents are too blind to see what's happening." He was right. My parents refused to admit that Valeria had no idea what she was doing. They kept defending her, saying she just needed time to adjust. Meanwhile, the restaurant was hemorrhaging money. And that was when I made my decision. I was done being the family's laughingstock. It was time to start planning my next move. The breaking point: things went downhill fast. One night, a group of VIP clients, big real estate tycoons who'd been coming to Asador Molina for years, came in and ordered their usual steaks. The problem? In her infinite wisdom, Valeria had switched to a cheaper butcher without telling Hugo. So when the steaks arrived overcooked, chewy, an absolute disaster, I was in the back washing dishes when I heard shouting coming from the dining room. I grabbed a cloth and peeked through the kitchen doors just in time to see one of the VIPs. A guy in a designer suit, holding up his plate like it was garbage. "What is this?" he roared. Valeria was there, with a fake smile plastered on her face. "Oh, sir, I assure you this isn't the quality we're used to," he cut her off, his voice sharp as a knife. "I've been eating here for 15 years. Your father ran a great restaurant. But this?" He shoved the plate towards her with contempt. "This is an embarrassment." The entire restaurant went silent. Valeria's face turned as red as a tomato. She opened her mouth to say something, probably to blame Hugo, but the VIP didn't care. He threw his napkin on the table, gestured to his companions to follow him, and muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, "We'll take our business elsewhere." And just like that, Asador Molina lost some of its best clients. "You have no future here." That night, after closing, Valeria called a staff meeting, which really meant she wanted to yell at everyone and pretend it wasn't her fault. We all gathered in the kitchen while she paced back and forth, arms crossed. "I don't know what's going on with you people," she snapped. "But the food has been inconsistent, the service is a mess, and the customers are complaining." Hugo let out a low chuckle. "Maybe because you fired half the staff and started cutting corners?" Valeria shot him a murderous look. "If you can't handle the changes, Hugo, no one's forcing you to stay." That shut him up. Then she turned to me. "And you," she said, pointing a finger at me. "I know you think you're some hotshot chef just because Hugo let you play around in the kitchen. But let's get something straight. You're a dishwasher. That's all you are. That's all you'll ever be." The room went silent. I felt something snap inside me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I just pitied her. She was someone so scared of me actually being better than her. I stepped forward, wiping my hands on my apron. "You really believe that?" I asked quietly. She smirked. "I know it." I nodded, pulling off my apron and dropping it on the counter. "Okay. Then." And with that I walked out. I heard Hugo call after me, but I didn't stop. I just kept walking. I'd wasted enough time in that place. It was time to start building something better. What happens next? That was the night I walked away from Asador Molina for good. And what Valeria didn't know, I'd been planning my next move for months. The connections I'd made in the kitchen weren't just friends. They were my future team. The secret recipes I'd perfected weren't just a hobby. They were going to make me famous. And the customers Valeria was losing? I knew exactly where they were going to start eating soon. Because I wasn't just leaving Asador Molina behind, I was about to become its biggest competitor. To be continued. So Reddit, want to know how I built a restaurant that made my family regret underestimating me? Because believe me, this is where the story gets really good. The rise of Rodrigo's Prime. You've been waiting for this moment. This is the part where Valeria finally realizes she's made the worst mistake of her life. The night Rodrigo's Prime opened was everything I dreamed of. The kitchen was on point, the waiters were impeccable, and the food a masterpiece. And then Valeria walked through the door. And that's when things got really interesting. The showdown at Rodrigo's Prime. I was in the kitchen, plating a tomahawk ribeye when Mateo, my bartender, nudged me. "Dude," he said, nodding towards the entrance. "Look who just showed up." I wiped my hands on my apron and looked up. And there she was, Valeria, standing in the reception area with the expression of someone who'd just seen a ghost. Her arms were crossed, her jaw tense, but her eyes, pure panic. Because she knew. She knew this place was packed. She knew half the faces in the crowd were former Asador Molina customers. And she knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. The day it all got worse. Before I could say anything, a familiar voice boomed across the restaurant. "Rodrigo, my friend." Just in time to see Mr. Vargas, one of Asador Molina's all-time VIP clients, the same one who'd stormed off in the middle of his meal months ago. But this time he wasn't angry. He was smiling. "You've outdone yourself, kid," he said, raising his glass. "This ribeye, the best I've had in years." The entire restaurant turned to look. Valeria's face went pale. And it was in that moment I knew I had won. I walked over to Valeria, wiping my hands on my apron. "Welcome to Rodrigo's Prime," I said lightly. "Table for one?" Her nostrils flared. "What do you think you're doing?" I raised an eyebrow. "Running a successful restaurant. You should try it sometime." She sucked in a sharp breath. "You poached my staff." "I didn't poach them," I corrected. "You fired them. Or treated them so badly they quit." "I simply gave them a place where they're actually valued." She looked around the restaurant, her eyes darting from table to table. This is ridiculous," she muttered. "You really think you can compete with Asador Molina?" I smiled smugly. "Compete, Valeria? I'm not competing. I'm winning." She scoffed. "This place is just a fad. People will get bored. They'll go back to Asador Molina." Just as she said that, one of my waiters walked past us carrying a sizzling sirloin. A couple at the next table turned their heads and stared at it, as if it were the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen. I tilted my head. "Yeah, I don't think so." Valeria's hands clenched into fists. "Mom and Dad will hear about this." I smiled wider. "Oh, I'm counting on it." She spun on her heels and stormed out, shoving past patrons as she made her way to the door. And me? I just went back to the kitchen. I had a restaurant to run. The fallout the next morning, my phone started ringing nonstop. First my mother, then my father, then Valeria again and again. I ignored every single call. Then Mateo sent me a text. "Mateo, dude, check out Asador Molina's Yelp page." I opened the app and it was a massacre. Customers were tearing the place apart. Complaints about raw steaks, slow service, overpriced drinks, and worst of all, went to Asador Molina for my anniversary, but the place was half empty. Then I found out why. Everyone's eating at Rodrigo's Prime. I laughed out loud. It wasn't just a few bad reviews, it was an avalanche. Asador Molina wasn't just losing customers, it was hemorrhaging. And Valeria knew it. The desperate call that afternoon. I finally answered when my father called. "Rodrigo," he started, his voice strained. "We need to talk." "Ah, yes," I said, leaning back in my chair. "About time." He snapped. "Your mother is upset. Valeria is upset. We need to find a solution to this." "Solution to what?" I asked, feigning innocence. He growled. "You know perfectly well what I'm talking about. Asador is in trouble, and you're stealing our customers." "I'm not stealing anything," I replied calmly. "People are choosing to eat here instead of at Asador Molina. Maybe you should ask yourselves why." Silence. Then he sighed. "Come home. Let's talk about this." I chuckled dryly. "Dad, I am home. Rodrigo's Prime is my home now." Click. I hung up. The beginning of the end for Asador Molina that week. Asador Molina launched a desperate promotion. 50% off all steaks, trying to win back customers. It backfired spectacularly. People would come in, see the half-empty restaurant, eat their mediocre steaks, and never return. Meanwhile, at Rodrigo's Prime, we were fully booked for the next 3 months. And that's when I knew. It was only a matter of time before Asador Molina collapsed. Alright Reddit, here we are. The final chapter. The part where my parents finally realized they'd made the worst mistake of their lives. When Asador Molina hit rock bottom, Rodrigo's Prime was thriving. Reservations full for months, people raving about our steaks, our service, our atmosphere. Meanwhile, Valeria was sinking. And then one night, just as I was gearing up for another pack service, guess who walked through the door? My parents. And let me tell you, they didn't look happy. The plea for help I saw at the moment they walked in. My father's face was drawn, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. They stood at the entrance, completely out of place. I took my time approaching them, letting them absorb the success they never believed I could achieve. Table for two? I asked, my voice even. My father exhaled heavily. Rodrigo, we need to talk. I raised an eyebrow. You can talk while you eat. They say the sirloin here is excellent. My mother crossed her arms. Don't be difficult, Rodrigo. I smiled thinly. Oh, I'm just following the family motto, Mom. You know, start from the bottom. Her face flushed. I led them to a table in the back where we wouldn't be interrupted. As soon as they sat down, my father leaned forward. Asador Molina is in trouble. I feigned surprise. Really? I hadn't noticed. He gritted his teeth. We don't need your sarcasm right now. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Then what do you need? My mother sighed, playing with her napkin. We want you back, Rodrigo. For a second I almost laughed. They wanted me back. After everything. Why? I asked. My father cleared his throat. We need someone who actually understands the kitchen. Someone who can bring back the quality people expect. I tilted my head. And what about Valeria? I thought she was the future of the business. My mother winced. My father sighed. She's struggling. Struggling? They handed her a successful restaurant on a silver platter, and she still managed to ruin it. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. You pushed me aside, gave my position to Valeria, told me I was nothing more than a dishwasher, and now when you've driven Asador Molina to the brink of collapse, you want my help? Neither of them answered. I let the silence stretch, watching them shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then I delivered the final blow. Asador isn't in trouble. It's dying. My mother's eyes widened. My father's jaw tightened. And you know the worst part? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. This didn't have to happen. You chose this. The offer they couldn't refuse. They sat there, speechless. They knew I was right. Finally, my father sighed. Rodrigo, what do you want? I pretended to think about it. Then I slid a piece of paper across the table. I'll save Asador Molina, I said. On one condition. My father picked up the sheet. His eyes scanned the words and his face paled. You want to buy Asador Molina? My mother exclaimed. For a ridiculously low price, I confirmed. Let's be honest, you're desperate. If you don't sell it to me, you'll have to sell it to someone else, and they won't be half as generous. My father clenched his jaw. Rodrigo, this is our family's legacy. It was your legacy, I corrected. You threw it away when you chose Valeria over me. My mother shook her head. But Rodrigo, we built that place. And I built this one. I cut her off. Without you. Silence. I let the truth sink in for a moment. Finally, my father exhaled. He looked at my mother, then back at me. We'll think about it. I smiled thinly. Take your time. But I'd act fast before there's nothing left to sell. And with that, I stood up and walked away. The final blow. 2 weeks later, I got a call. My father's voice was flat. It's yours. I hung up and smiled. Asador Molina was mine now. But I had no intention of saving it. I was going to reinvent it, transform it, and most importantly, erase its name forever. The grand reopening 6 months later, after a complete renovation, the restaurant that was once Asador Molina had a new sign above the entrance. Prime by Rodrigo Molina. No Asador. No Molina. Nothing to link my success to their name. On reopening night, the restaurant was packed. And the best part? I saw Valeria standing outside, scowling at the sign. I walked out. You had everything you wanted with Rodrigo's Prime. Why take Asador Molina too? I smiled. Because it was never about taking it away. It was about proving that I was always the one who should have been running it. She swallowed hard. For the first time in her life, Valeria had nothing to say. And that was the sweetest victory of all. Epilogue 1 year later. It's been a year since I took over. Rodrigo's Prime is still a hit. Prime by Rodrigo Molina is one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, and Asador Molina is a distant memory. My parents moved to Marbella, slowly fading into obscurity. Valeria tried to open a consulting agency, but let's just say no one's lining up for her advice. And me? I finally have what I always wanted. Not just a restaurant. Not just success. I have respect. I have the last laugh.